The autumn wind of 1889 carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke through the streets of Hartford, Connecticut. But 19-year-old Elena Morrison couldn't see the amber maples or the smoke curling from chimneys. She pressed her fingertips against the rough brick wall of the textile mill, using it as her guide while the cacophony of machinery thundered from within. Her other hand clutched a worn wicker basket containing the meager lunch she'd prepared before dawn. Stale bread, a thin slice of cheese, and an apple bruised from yesterday's market discards. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena's world existed in sounds, textures, and smells. The sharp tang of industrial dye that stung her nostrils, the rhythmic clatter of looms that seemed to pulse through the very foundations of the building, and the hurried footsteps of workers rushing past her on the cobblestone street. She'd lost her sight to scarlet fever when she was 7, and in the 12 years since, she'd learned to navigate a world that saw her blindness as a burden rather than simply another way of experiencing life. Her fingers found the familiar indentation in the brick where mortar had crumbled away, her landmark. 3 more steps to the left, then forward until she reached the wooden door that led to the mill's administrative offices. Elena had walked this route every day for 3 months, ever since her stepfather had grudgingly found her work as a thread. Sorter in the basement of the Whitman Textile Company. It was dark, tedious work that required nimble fingers rather than sight, separating tangled threads by texture and thickness. The morning supervisor, Mr. Fletcher, barely acknowledged her presence as she made her way to the narrow staircase leading to the basement. His boots scraped against the wooden floor above her head throughout the day, a reminder that even here, in the depths of the building where her blindness mattered less, she remained under constant scrutiny. The other workers, mostly young women, from Irish and Italian families, spoke in hushed tones when she passed, their conversations falling silent as if her presence made them uncomfortable. Elena had grown accustomed to the whispers that followed her everywhere. "Poor thing," they'd say. "What use is a blind girl?" The words stung, but she'd learned to armor herself with quiet dignity. Her mother had taught her that before the consumption took her 3 years ago, whispering lessons about inner strength. During Elena's childhood nights of rage and confusion about her lost sight. "Your hands can see what others miss," her mother Sarah had said, guiding Elena's fingers over embroidered flowers on a pillowcase. "Your ears can hear truths that sighted people ignore. Don't let them make you small because they lack imagination." But Sarah was gone now, and Elena lived under the increasingly hostile roof of her stepfather, Theodore Blackwood. He'd married her mother when Elena was 15, a stocky man with graying whiskers who owned a small dry goods store on Elm Street. For 2 years after Sarah's death, he'd tolerated Elena's presence, seeing her as an obligation that came with inheriting his late wife's modest savings. But his patience had worn thin as his business struggled, and Elena's blindness became what he saw as an insurmountable liability. The basement of the textile mill smelled of cotton dust and machine oil. Elena settled at her designated table, running her hands over the surface to ensure everything was in its proper place. Her water cup sat 2 inches from her right elbow, her sorting boxes arranged in a precise line before her. The familiarity of routine provided comfort in a world that often felt chaotic and unpredictable. She began her work, fingers dancing through tangles of silk and cotton threads, separating them by weight and texture with a speed that surprised even the supervisors. Her blindness, which others saw as a disability, had sharpened her other senses to an extraordinary degree. She could feel the difference between threads spun in different mills, detect the subtle variations that indicated quality or flaws that sighted workers often missed. Hours passed in the rhythm of sorting, the sounds of the mill above providing a constant backdrop. Elena's mind wandered to the conversation she'd overheard the night before, when Theodore thought she was asleep in her small attic room. He'd been speaking with his brother Marcus, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the house. "She's 19 now, Theodore," Marcus had said, his tone suggesting this wasn't their first discussion about Elena's future. "You can't keep her forever. The girl eats more than she earns, and that mill work won't last long. Fletcher's already complained about having to accommodate her." Theodore's response had chilled Elena to the bone. "I've been thinking about that. There are places, institutions where they take care of people like her, or private arrangements. Some families need help and don't mind the limitation." The word limitation had hit Eleanor like a physical blow. In Theodore's mind, her blindness reduced her entire being to a single defining flaw. The casual way he discussed her future, as if she were livestock to be sold or disposed of, made her stomach twist with a familiar mixture of fear and anger. "Private arrangements?" Marcus had pressed. "What do you mean?" "Labor contracts. Wealthy families sometimes need domestic help and don't mind if the help can't see much. Cheaper that way, and they get someone grateful for the work. There's a man coming through town next week, handles these sorts of transactions." Elena had pulled her thin blanket over her head, trying to block out the sound of her stepfather planning to sell her like a piece of unwanted furniture. The walls of her attic room had seemed to close in around her, the darkness that was her constant companion feeling more oppressive than ever. Now sitting in the mill basement with threads sliding through her fingers, Elena felt the weight of that overheard conversation settling on her shoulders like a lead cloak. Theodore's patience had finally run out. She was 19, old enough to be married off or sent away, and her blindness made her unmarriageable in his eyes. The mill work that she performed competently, even excellently, wasn't enough to justify her continued presence in his household. The lunch bell rang, and Elena carefully set aside her work. She climbed the stairs to the main floor, using the handrail that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The October air was crisp when she stepped outside, and she found her usual spot on a wooden crate behind the building, where she could eat in relative solitude. As she unwrapped her meager lunch, Elena heard footsteps approaching. Not the hurried pace of workers on their break, but deliberate, measured steps that paused just in front of her. "Miss Morrison?" The voice was unfamiliar, cultured, with the slight accent of someone from the south. Elena looked up, though she couldn't see the speaker. "Yes? My name is Cornelius Whitman. I own this mill." Elena's heart skipped. She'd never met the mill owner, had only heard his name spoken in reverent tones by the supervisors. She started to stand, but his voice stopped her. "Please remain seated. I wanted to speak with you about your work." Fear crept up Elena's spine. Had she made an error? Was this the end of her employment? She clasped her hands in her lap, waiting for whatever blow was about to fall. "Mr. Fletcher tells me you're the fastest thread sorter we've ever employed," Whitman continued. "Your accuracy rate is remarkable. In 3 months, you've had fewer errors than workers who've been with us for years." Elena blinked in surprise. "Thank you, sir. I also understand that your situation at home may be changing soon." The words hit Elena like cold water. How did he know about Theodore's plans? Had her stepfather already been in contact with people about her future? Her silence seemed answer enough for Whitman. "I have a proposition," he said, his voice gentle but businesslike. "I'm expanding operations to our facility in Springfield, Massachusetts. I need someone with your particular skills to oversee thread quality there. It would mean leaving Hartford, leaving your current living situation. The position comes with room and board, and wages that would allow you some independence." Elena's mind reeled. An offer of real work, real wages, a chance to escape Theodore's house before he could carry out his plans to sell her to some unknown arrangement. It seemed too good to be true. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you offer this to me?" Whitman was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of personal understanding. "My youngest daughter was born deaf, Miss Morrison. I've learned that what the world sees as limitations are often simply different ways of experiencing life. Your blindness doesn't diminish your value. It's given you abilities that sighted workers don't possess. I need those abilities in Springfield." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. For the first time in years, someone was offering her opportunity rather than charity, work rather than pity. But the magnitude of the decision, leaving everything she knew, traveling to an unfamiliar city, filled her with uncertainty. "I would need to give you an answer soon," Whitman continued. "The position begins next month. Think carefully about what kind of future you want to build for yourself." As his footsteps faded away, Elena sat in stunned silence. The bread in her hands had gone cold, but she barely noticed. For the first time since her mother's death, someone had seen her potential rather than her limitations. But taking such a leap would mean abandoning the familiar navigation routes she'd memorized, the carefully constructed routines that made her daily life manageable. The afternoon passed in a blur of sorting and uncertainty. When the final bell rang, Elena gathered her basket and began the walk home to Theodore's house, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. The familiar route that usually provided comfort now felt like a countdown to an unwanted fate. Theodore's house sat on Maple Street, a narrow two-story structure with peeling paint and a front porch that sagged under the weight of accumulated neglect. Elena's fingers found the loose board on the third porch step, then counted 6 steps to the front door. The house smelled of old tobacco and the lingering remnants of whatever meager dinner Theodore had prepared for himself. "Elena?" Theodore's voice called from the parlor. "Come here." She set her basket by the door and made her way to the parlor, her hands trailing along the wall to guide her. Theodore was sitting in his favorite chair, the one that creaked when he shifted his weight. But he wasn't alone. Elena could hear the breathing of at least 2 other people in the room, and the air carried the scent of unfamiliar cologne and leather. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Elena, this is Mr. Josiah Crane," Theodore said, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that made Elena's skin crawl. "He's come to discuss your future." Elena stood frozen in the doorway, her worst fears crystallizing. Theodore had moved forward with his plans without consulting her, treating her like property to be transferred rather than a person with her own desires and agency. "Miss Morrison," Crane's voice was smooth, practiced, like a man accustomed to negotiating transactions. "Your stepfather tells me you're skilled with textile work despite your condition. I represent a family in Albany who could use someone with your particular abilities." The word condition hung in the air like a slap. Elena's blindness reduced to a medical curiosity, something to be managed rather than simply accepted as part of who she was. "What kind of work?" Elena asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Domestic service primarily. The Morrison family has extensive textile interests, and they could use someone to manage their household mending and thread work. Room and board provided, of course, and a small wage." Elena recognized the careful phrasing. Small wage likely meant barely enough to survive, and domestic service could encompass any number of unpleasant tasks. The Morrisons, she noticed the similarity to her own surname with bitter irony, would essentially own her, just as Theodore was attempting to sell her now. "The arrangement would be permanent," Crane continued. "A contract ensures stability for all parties involved." Permanent. The word echoed in Elena's mind like the slamming of a prison door. Once she signed whatever papers Crane carried, she would belong to the Morrison family as surely as if they'd purchased her outright. "I need time to consider this," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. Theodore's chair creaked as he leaned forward. "There's nothing to consider, Elena. Mr. Crane is offering you security, a place where your blindness won't be such a burden. You should be grateful. Grateful." Elena had heard that word applied to her situation countless times over the years. Grateful for charity, grateful for tolerance, grateful for whatever scraps of dignity people chose to offer her, but gratitude for what amounted to indentured servitude felt like a betrayal of everything her mother had taught her about her own worth. "The papers could be signed tonight," Crane said. "I have transportation arranged for tomorrow morning. The Morrison family is eager to have this settled quickly." Elena felt the room closing in around her, the future that Theodore and Crane were planning for her stretching ahead like a dark tunnel with no exit. Her blindness, which she'd learned to navigate and even find advantages in, was being used as justification for trading away her freedom. "I need some air," Elena said, turning toward the door. "Elena," Theodore began, but she was already moving, her familiarity with the house allowing her to navigate quickly despite her shaking hands. She pushed through the front door and onto the porch, gulping the cool evening air. Behind her, she could hear Theodore's voice rising in irritation and Crane's smooth responses, but their words became meaningless noise against the pounding of her heart. For the first time in her life, Elena faced a choice that would determine not just her immediate future, but the entire course of her existence. Theodore's plan would mean safety of a sort, but it would also mean surrendering any hope of real independence or genuine respect. Whitman's offer represented possibility, but also the terrifying prospect of venturing into an unknown world with only her own abilities to sustain her. As she stood on the sagging porch, listening to the evening sounds of Hartford, the clip-clop of horses, the distant laughter from a tavern, the rustle of leaves in the October wind, Elena realized that her mother's words about inner strength had prepared her for exactly this moment. The choice between accepting the limitations others imposed on her or insisting on her right to determine her own path. The voices in the parlor grew louder, and Eleanor knew that her time for decision was running out. Theodore and Crane expected her compliance, her grateful acceptance of whatever arrangement they'd negotiated. But, as she thought of Whitman's offer, of the possibility of work that valued her abilities rather than simply tolerating her presence, Elena felt something kindle in her chest that she'd thought Theodore had extinguished. Hope. The front door creaked behind her, and Theodore's heavy footsteps crossed the porch. "Elena, stop this foolishness and come inside. Mr. Crane has been generous with his offer, and you're being ungrateful." Elena turned to face the sound of his voice, her back straight and her chin raised. For 19 years, she'd navigated a world that told her she was less than whole, that her blindness made her a burden to be tolerated rather than a person to be valued. But standing on that porch, with the October wind carrying the scent of possibility, Elena Morrison made the choice that would change everything. "No," she said simply. The word hung in the evening air, small but absolute. Theodore's sharp intake of breath told her he hadn't expected resistance, and Elena realized that this single word, this refusal to accept the future others had planned for her, was the first step toward claiming the life she deserved. Theodore's face flushed red in the lamplight, his breathing heavy with the kind of rage Elena had learned to recognize in the tightness of his voice. "What did you say to me?" Eleanor's hands trembled against the porch railing, but her voice held steady. "I said no. I won't sign any papers with Mr. Crane." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Inside the parlor, she could hear Crane, clearing his throat uncomfortably, the leather of his portfolio creaking as he shifted in his chair. A carriage rattled past on Maple Street, its wheels echoing off the narrow houses that lined the block. "You ungrateful little—" Theodore's voice cracked with fury. "After everything I've done for you, keeping you fed and housed, when any sensible man would have sent you to the state asylum years ago. This is how you repay my charity." Elena flinched at the word asylum, knowing Theodore wielded it deliberately. The Connecticut Hospital for the Insane housed not only those with mental afflictions, but also the blind, the deaf, and anyone whose family could no longer afford their care. It was a threat he dangled over her head whenever her independence showed too strongly. "I've found other employment," Elena said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider. "Mr. Whitman at the textile mill has offered me a position in Springfield." Theodore's sharp laugh cut through the evening air. "Whitman, that fool's been filling your head with nonsense, has he? You think you can survive on your own, stumbling around strange streets, dependent on the kindness of strangers who'll tire of your limitations within a month?" Each word was calculated to wound, to remind Elena of every stumble, every moment of confusion she'd experienced while learning to navigate the world without sight. But tonight, instead of shrinking under his verbal assault, Elena found herself thinking of her mother's voice during those long nights when fever had stolen her vision. "Your blindness isn't your weakness, Elena," Sarah had whispered, holding her daughter's hand as she wept in frustration. "It's simply a different way of seeing the world. Don't let anyone convince you that different means less." "Mr. Crane," Theodore called toward the house, "perhaps you could explain to my stepdaughter exactly what happens to blind women who think they can make their own way in the world." Crane emerged onto the porch, his expensive boots clicking against the wooden boards. Elena could smell the pomade in his hair, the wool of his tailored coat, the metallic scent of the coins he'd likely brought to finalize their transaction. "Miss Morrison," Crane said, his voice adopting the patronizing tone men used when addressing children or women they considered foolish. "I understand your reluctance, but you must be realistic about your prospects. The Morrison family in Albany represents security, protection from the harsh realities that face people in your condition. The world outside domestic service is unforgiving to those with physical limitations." Elena's jaw tightened. "And what exactly would my duties encompass in this position?" Crane hesitated, and in that pause, Elena heard everything she needed to know. The Morrison family wasn't looking for skilled textile work or even ordinary domestic service. They wanted someone whose blindness would ensure compliance, someone who couldn't easily leave or report mistreatment, someone whose testimony would be dismissed if questions arose about their treatment. "General household duties," Crane said finally. "Mending, cleaning, whatever tasks the family requires. The contract ensures your care for life, Miss Morrison. Few people in your situation receive such generous offers." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October evening. A lifetime contract with people she'd never met, in a city she'd never visited, performing duties that remained deliberately vague. It was indentured servitude dressed up in legal language, and both Theodore and Crane knew it. "I decline," Elena said firmly. "I'll be pursuing the position in Springfield." Theodore's hand slammed against the porch railing, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "You'll do no such thing. I'm your legal guardian until you marry, and I say you'll sign Crane's papers tonight." Elena's heart raced. She'd forgotten about Theodore's legal authority over her, so focused on the moral aspect of his betrayal that she'd overlooked the legal reality. At 19, she remained under his guardianship, unable to make contracts or travel without his permission. "The girl seems confused about her circumstances," Crane observed. Perhaps some time to reflect on more controlled environment would clarify her thinking. The implication hung heavy in the autumn air. If Elena continued to resist, Theodore could have her committed to the state hospital, claiming she was mentally unfit to make decisions. Her blindness would support such a claim in the eyes of authorities, who viewed any disability as evidence of incompetence. Elena's mind raced through her limited options. She could submit to Crane's contract and disappear into domestic servitude. She could continue resisting and risk commitment to an asylum. Or she could find a third path, one that required more courage than she'd ever mustered. "I need to gather my belongings," Elena said quietly. Theodore's satisfaction was audible in his relieved exhale. Finally showing some sense. "Crane, shall we complete the paperwork while she packs?" Elena nodded submissively and made her way into the house, climbing the narrow stairs to her attic room. But instead of packing for Albany, she moved with desperate efficiency to prepare for an entirely different journey. Her mother's small sewing kit went into a canvas bag, along with her few pieces of clothing and the precious $10 she'd saved from her mill wages, hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The voices from the parlor drifted upstairs as Theodore and Crane discussed the terms of her transfer. She heard mention of travel arrangements, of payments, of her expected arrival in Albany. They spoke about her as if she were cargo to be shipped, her preferences and fears irrelevant to their transaction. Elena waited until the conversation grew animated with the details of their business, then crept down the stairs with the silent movement she'd perfected during years of navigating the house without disturbing Theodore's evening routines. The front door would creak if opened, but the kitchen door that led to the small backyard remained well-oiled from her daily trips to the pump. She slipped through the kitchen, her fingers finding the familiar landmarks that guided her path. The door handle turned silently, and she stepped into the night air, pulling the door closed behind her with barely a whisper of sound. The backyard connected to an alley that ran behind the row of houses on Maple Street. Eleanor had explored this route during her restless evenings, when Theodore's drinking made the house unbearable and she'd sought solace in the night air. Now, that knowledge became her salvation. She moved carefully but quickly through the alley, counting steps and using the wooden fences to guide her path. Her destination was Mrs. Catherine Walsh's boarding house on Elm Street, 6 blocks away, through a route she'd memorized during months of errands to the market. Mrs. Walsh was a widow who'd known Eleanor's mother, one of the few people in Hartford, who treated Elena's blindness as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. More importantly, she was known for her fierce independence and her willingness to help women in difficult circumstances. The boarding house sat at the corner of Elm and 3rd Streets, its front porch marked by the distinctive creak of the second step and the scent of the rose bushes Mrs. Walsh tended with obsessive care. Elena climbed those steps now, her heart hammering as she knocked softly on the familiar door. "Elena," Mrs. Walsh's voice carried surprise and concern. "Child, what are you doing out at this hour?" "Mrs. Walsh, I need help," Elena said, her careful composure finally cracking. "Theodore is trying to sell me to a labor contractor. I've run away." The door opened wider, and Mrs. Walsh's warm hand touched Elena's arm, guiding her into the boarding house's front parlor. The room smelled of lavender and beeswax, comforting scents that reminded Elena of her mother's presence. "Tell me everything," Mrs. Walsh said, settling Elena into a soft chair beside the fireplace. Elena poured out the evening's events: Crane's arrival, the contract for permanent domestic service, Theodore's threats about the asylum. Mrs. Walsh listened in growing anger, her sharp intakes of breath punctuating Elena's account. "That bastard," Mrs. Walsh muttered when Elena finished. "Forgive my language, child, but Theodore Blackwood is selling you like livestock, and he knows it." Elena felt tears threatening for the first time that evening. Having someone else validate her fears, confirm that her resistance was justified rather than selfish, broke through the defensive wall she'd built around her emotions. "Mr. Whitman offered me work in Springfield," Elena said. Real work with real wages. But Theodore has legal authority over me. I can't accept it without his permission. Mrs. Walsh was quiet for a long moment, and Elena could hear her fingers drumming against the arm of her chair, a habit that indicated deep thinking. There might be a way, Mrs. Walsh said finally. It's not without risk, but it's better than what Theodore has planned for you. Elena leaned forward eagerly. What do you mean? My nephew Patrick drives freight wagons between here and Springfield. He leaves before dawn tomorrow with a load of textiles for the mills. If you were to travel with him, you could be in Springfield before Theodore realizes you're gone. The plan was simple but dangerous. Elena would be traveling without legal permission, technically making her a runaway. If caught, she could be forcibly returned to Theodore or committed to an institution. But the alternative, a lifetime of servitude under Crane's contract, made the risk seem worthwhile. What about afterward? Elena asked. Even if I reach Springfield, Theodore could demand my return. Mrs. Walsh's chair creaked as she stood. One problem at a time, child. First, we get you away from here. Then we'll see about making the arrangement permanent. Elena spent the remaining hours before dawn in Mrs. Walsh's spare room, lying awake and listening to the sounds of the boarding house settling around her. Footsteps in the hallway, the distant chiming of a clock, the whistle of wind through the window frames. Each sound might be among the last she'd hear in Hartford, the city where she'd spent her entire life. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, Mrs. Walsh knocked softly on her door. Patrick's here, she whispered. Are you ready? Eleanor gathered her small bag and followed Mrs. Walsh to the kitchen, where a young man with calloused hands and the scent of horses about him waited beside the back door. Miss Morrison, Patrick Walsh said, his voice respectful but urgent. Aunt Catherine explained your situation. I can get you to Springfield, but the journey won't be comfortable. You'll need to ride hidden among the textile bales. Elena nodded, understanding that comfort was a luxury she couldn't afford. Freedom mattered more than ease, and she was willing to endure whatever discomfort the journey required. Mrs. Walsh pressed a small bundle into Elena's hands. Food for the road, she explained. And this. She placed a folded paper against Eleanor's palm. A letter to Mr. Whitman, explaining your circumstances. It might help when you arrive. Elena embraced the older woman, her throat tight with gratitude she couldn't adequately express. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Your mother would be proud, Mrs. Walsh replied. You're choosing courage over safety, just as she would have done. Patrick led Elena through the pre-dawn streets to where his wagon waited, loaded with bales of finished textiles bound for the Springfield mills. He helped her climb into the wagon bed, arranging the canvas covers to create a hidden space among the cargo. The journey takes most of the day, Patrick explained. We'll stop twice to rest the horses, but you'll need to stay hidden. If anyone asks, I'm carrying textiles and nothing else. Elena settled into her hiding place, the rough canvas, surrounding her like a cocoon. The wagon lurched into motion, and she felt the familiar streets of Hartford falling away beneath the wheels. Each turn took her further from the life Theodore had planned for her, and closer to an uncertain but self-determined future. As the wagon rolled through the awakening city, Elena thought of Theodore and Crane discovering her absence. Their anger would be considerable, their efforts to retrieve her likely swift and thorough. But she'd gained precious time, and with luck, that time would be enough to reach Springfield and claim the opportunity Whitman had offered. The wagon wheels found the rhythm of the open road, and Elena clutched Mrs. Walsh's letter against her chest. Whatever awaited her in Springfield, success or failure, acceptance or rejection, it would be the result of her own choices rather than others' plans for her life. For the first time since her mother's death, Elena Morrison was truly free. Wagon's wheels ground to a halt after what felt like an eternity of jolting over rutted roads and swaying around corners that made Elena's stomach lurch with each turn. Her body ached from hours of remaining motionless among the textile bales, the rough canvas having left scratches on her arms, and the persistent smell of dyed wool making her head throb. Through the fabric coverings, she could hear Patrick's voice speaking to someone in clipped, businesslike tones. "Delivery for Whitman Mills," Patrick announced. "Finest cotton batting from Hartford, shipped direct." "Right on schedule," came an unfamiliar voice with a slight Irish accent. "Mr. Whitman's been expecting this shipment. Drive around to the loading dock and we'll get you unloaded straight away." Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as the wagon lurched back into motion. Springfield! She'd actually made it to Springfield, Massachusetts, nearly 100 miles from Theodore's house and Crane's contract. But arrival was only the beginning of her challenges. She still needed to find Mr. Whitman, convince him to honor his job offer despite her unconventional arrival, and somehow establish herself in a completely unfamiliar city. The wagon stopped again, and Elena heard the sounds of a busy mill yard, men calling to each other, the creak of pulleys, the thud of heavy cargo being moved. Patrick's boots scraped against the wagon bed as he climbed up to begin unloading, and his voice dropped to a whisper near her hiding place. "Stay put until I give the signal," he murmured. "Let me find Whitman first and explain the situation." Elena remained perfectly still as bales of textiles were lifted away from around her hiding spot. Each movement brought more light filtering through the canvas, and she could feel the autumn air growing cooler as her covering grew thinner. Voices moved back and forth across the loading dock, and she caught fragments of conversation about production schedules, quality specifications, and shipping deadlines. "Patrick Walsh, isn't it?" A cultured voice cut through the work sounds. "From Hartford. How was your journey?" "Smooth enough, Mr. Whitman," Patrick replied. "Though I have a message for you, sir, from Mrs. Catherine Walsh. She said you'd want to hear it privately." Elena held her breath as footsteps moved away from the wagon. She could no longer make out the words, but she heard the rise and fall of Patrick's voice explaining her situation, followed by a longer silence. When the footsteps returned, they were accompanied by measured steps that she recognized as belonging to Cornelius Whitman. "Miss Morrison," Whitman's voice called softly, "you can come out now. You're safe here." Elena pushed aside the remaining canvas and accepted Patrick's hand to help her climb down from the wagon bed. Her legs trembled from the long confinement, and she had to grip the wagon side to steady herself as feeling returned to her cramped muscles. The mill yard smelled of machine oil, sawdust, and the Connecticut River that she could hear flowing nearby. "Mr. Whitman," Elena began, her voice hoarse from hours of enforced silence, "I apologize for arriving this way. I wanted to accept your job offer, but circumstances made it impossible to travel through normal channels." Whitman's hand touched her elbow gently, guiding her away from the busy loading dock. "Mrs. Walsh's letter explained the situation quite thoroughly," he said. "Theodore Blackwood's behavior is deplorable, and you were right to escape it." Elena felt a wave of relief wash over her. Whitman wasn't angry about her unconventional arrival or her stepfather's pursuit, but relief was quickly followed by practical concerns about her immediate needs. "I have very little with me," Elena admitted. "Just the clothes I'm wearing and a few dollars. I realize this puts you in a difficult position regarding the job offer." "Nonsense," Whitman replied briskly. "Talent and determination matter more than luggage. The position I described is still available, along with room and board. We'll simply need to accelerate your transition into the role." They walked across the mill yard, Elena using the sound of Whitman's footsteps and his occasional guidance to navigate around obstacles. The Springfield mill was larger than the Hartford facility, judging by the complexity of sounds. Multiple buildings with different types of machinery, more workers, the constant background hum of greater industrial activity. The living quarters are in the mill housing district, Whitman explained as they walked. Simple but comfortable accommodations for key employees. You'll have a small apartment with kitchen privileges and access to the company store for necessities. Elena had never lived alone, had never been responsible for managing her own household or cooking her own meals. The prospect was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, but it represented a level of independence she'd never dreamed possible. Under Theodore's roof, they stopped at a two-story brick building that stood apart from the mill proper. The sound of the river was stronger here, and Elena could smell the cleaner air away from the industrial smoke. Whitman guided her up a set of wooden steps to a landing where he fitted a key into a lock. "Apartment 3B, he said, opening the door. "It's furnished with basics, bed, table, chairs, cooking stove. The previous occupant left some household items that might be useful." Eleanor stepped into the space, her hands immediately going out to map its dimensions. The room was small but adequate, with wooden floors that creaked slightly under her feet, and windows that she could feel letting in afternoon sunlight. Her fingers found a simple table, 2 chairs, and along one wall, a cooking area with what felt like a cast-iron stove. "There's a bedroom through that doorway," Whitman continued, "and shared washing facilities at the end of the hall. The mill store is on the ground floor of this building, so you'll have easy access to food and other necessities." Elena completed her circuit of the main room, her mental map of the space taking shape. It was more than adequate, it was miraculous. Her own space, her own front door with a key, her own freedom to come and go as she chose. "Mr. Whitman," Elena said, turning toward his voice, "I can't adequately express my gratitude. This is far more than I expected." "You haven't seen your workplace yet," Whitman replied with what sounded like amusement. "That might temper your enthusiasm." He led her back downstairs and across the mill yard to a building that hummed with the sound of different machinery than she'd heard in Hartford. Inside, the air was warm and thick with cotton fibers, and Elena could identify the rhythmic sounds of multiple looms operating in coordination. "This is our quality control facility," Whitman explained. "We test every batch of thread and fabric before it leaves the mill. Your job will be to identify irregularities, variations in thickness, flaws in the spinning, inconsistencies that could affect the final product." Eleanor ran her fingers over a sample of cloth that Whitman placed in her hands. Immediately, she could feel variations in the weave that would be difficult to spot visually. Her fingertips detected loose threads, uneven tension, and slight differences in the cotton's quality that created texture variations across the fabric's surface. "This batch has problems," Elena said, continuing her examination. "The thread tension varies significantly across the width, and there are at least 3 places where the cotton quality drops noticeably." Whitman was quiet for a moment. "That fabric was rejected by our current quality inspector this morning," he said finally. "But it took him an hour with a magnifying glass to identify all the flaws you found in 30 seconds. Elena smiled, feeling the first real confidence she'd experienced since leaving Hartford. Her blindness, which Theodore had seen as nothing but limitation and burden, was actually an advantage in work that required tactile sensitivity and attention to detail that went beyond visual inspection. "When would you like me to start?" Elena asked. "Tomorrow morning if you're feeling up to it. But first, you'll need supplies for your apartment and a chance to settle in. Mrs. O'Brien runs the company store downstairs. She'll help you with immediate necessities." Elena spent the remainder of the afternoon establishing herself in her new life. Mrs. O'Brien, a motherly Irish woman with strong opinions about proper nutrition, helped her select basic food supplies, cooking utensils, and household items. The company store operated on credit for employees, with purchases deducted from wages, a system that allowed Elena to acquire what she needed without depleting her small savings. "You'll want good, sturdy shoes," Mrs. O'Brien advised, as Elena felt the various options. "The mill floors can be hard on feet, and you'll be standing most of the day. And proper wool stockings. New England winters bite harder than most folks expect." By evening, Elena had transformed the empty apartment into something resembling a home. Her few possessions looked pitifully small in the furnished rooms, but the space felt more welcoming, with her mother's sewing kit on the table and her own blanket on the bed. She prepared her first independent meal, a simple soup and bread purchased from Mrs. O'Brien, and ate it while listening to the sounds of Springfield settling into the night. The city was different from Hartford, busier and more industrial, with the constant background noise of mills and river traffic. But it was also anonymous in a way that felt liberating. Here she wasn't Theodore's burden or the blind girl who lived on Maple Street. She was simply Elena Morrison, skilled textile worker, resident of apartment 3B. The next morning brought Elena's first full day of work at the Springfield mill. She arrived early, navigating her new route with the careful attention she'd learned to pay to unfamiliar territory. The quality control facility was quieter in the early morning, with only a few workers preparing for the day's production testing. "Miss Morrison," a gruff voice called as she entered the building. "I'm Samuel Crawford, floor supervisor. Whitman says you're here to help with quality assessment." Elena nodded, extending her hand in greeting. Crawford's handshake was firm but brief, and she detected skepticism in his tone that suggested he had doubts about her ability to perform the work effectively. "I'll be honest," Crawford continued. "I'm not sure how this arrangement is supposed to work. Quality control requires precise visual inspection. I don't see how someone in your condition can identify flaws that trained inspectors sometimes." Miss Elena had encountered this attitude countless times, the assumption that blindness automatically disqualified her from meaningful work. Rather than argue, she decided to demonstrate her capabilities. "Could you provide me with a selection of fabric samples?" Elena asked. "A mixture of acceptable and flawed pieces, without telling me which is which." Crawford rustled through a collection of cloth samples, selecting several pieces that he arranged on the work table. Elena ran her hands over each sample methodically, her fingers reading the fabric like others might read printed text. "This first piece has inconsistent thread weight," Elena said, setting it aside. "The variation suggests problems with the spinning process, possibly inconsistent cotton quality in the raw material." Crawford was silent, but she could sense his attention focusing more intently on her assessment. "The second sample has good thread consistency, but the weave tension is uneven. It would likely develop weak spots with use." Elena continued through the samples, identifying flaws in some and approving others based on the information her fingers provided. When she finished, Crawford gathered the samples she'd rejected and compared them with his notes from the previous day's quality assessments. "These are the exact pieces we flagged as problematic," Crawford said, his voice carrying surprise and growing respect. "You found flaws that took our inspector considerable time to identify, and you did it faster than anyone I've seen." Eleanor felt a familiar warmth in her chest, the satisfaction of proving that her abilities exceeded others' expectations. "My blindness forces me to rely on touch and texture in ways that sighted people rarely develop," she explained. "What seems like a limitation in most situations becomes an advantage in work that requires tactile sensitivity." Crawford nodded thoughtfully. "I owe you an apology, Miss Morrison. I made assumptions based on my own ignorance. Let me show you the full scope of what we do here, and we'll see how your skills can best serve our quality standards." The morning passed quickly as Crawford introduced Elena to the various aspects of quality control work. She learned the different stages of production testing, the standards for acceptable variations, and the documentation requirements for rejected materials. Her hands grew familiar with the subtle differences between cotton grades, thread weights, and weaving patterns that determined fabric quality. During the lunch break, Elena sat outside the quality control building, enjoying the autumn air and the sounds of the busy mill yard. Her first morning of real work in Springfield had exceeded her hopes, providing both the intellectual challenge and the sense of contribution she'd craved during her years under Theodore's roof. "Miss Morrison?" A young woman's voice interrupted her thoughts. "I'm Margaret Sullivan from the spinning floor. Mr. Crawford sent me to ask if you could examine some thread samples we're having trouble with." Elena followed Margaret to the spinning facility, where the air vibrated with the hum of dozens of spinning machines. The noise was overwhelming at first, but Elena quickly learned to filter the mechanical sounds and focus on the variations that indicated problems with individual machines. "We're getting inconsistent thread from these 3 machines," Margaret explained, guiding Elena to a work table covered with thread samples. "The visual inspection doesn't show obvious problems, but something feels off about the finished product." Elena ran her fingers along the thread samples, feeling for variations in thickness, texture, and tension. Almost immediately, she detected subtle differences that suggested mechanical issues with the spinning apparatus. "This thread has microscopic variations that suggest the spindle speed isn't consistent," Elena said, holding up one sample. "The thickness varies in a regular pattern that indicates mechanical problems rather than material issues." Margaret leaned closer, examining the thread Elena indicated. "I can barely see what you're describing, but you're right. There is a pattern to the variations." Elena continued her examination, identifying similar problems with the other suspect. Machines. Her analysis provided specific information about mechanical adjustments needed to correct the quality issues, information that would have required extensive testing and analysis using conventional methods. "Miss Morrison," Margaret said as they finished the evaluation, "you've just saved us days of troubleshooting and testing. How did you learn to detect such subtle variations?" Elena smiled, thinking of her mother's patient lessons during those early years after losing her sight. "Necessity taught me to pay attention to details that most people overlook. My hands have learned to see things that eyes alone might miss." Word of Elena's diagnostic abilities spread quickly through the mill complex. By the end of her first week, supervisors from various departments were seeking her expertise with quality problems that had puzzled their regular inspection procedures. Elena found herself consulting on issues ranging from thread consistency to fabric durability, her tactile analysis providing insights that complemented traditional visual inspection methods. The work was challenging and satisfying in ways Elena had never experienced. For the first time in her life, her blindness was recognized as providing genuine advantages rather than simply being accommodated as a limitation. She was contributing real value to the mill's operations, earning her wages through skill and expertise rather than charity or pity. But even as Elena settled into her new life in Springfield, she remained aware that her escape from Theodore's control was likely temporary unless she could establish legal independence. Her stepfather's authority over her remained a threat that could disrupt the life she was building, and she knew that confrontation with that reality was inevitable. Now, though, Eleanor chose to focus on the immediate satisfaction of meaningful work and genuine independence. Each day brought new challenges and opportunities to prove her worth, and she was determined to establish herself so firmly in Springfield that no legal maneuvering could drag her back to the life Theodore had planned for her. As autumn deepened, Into early winter, Elena Morrison was no longer the frightened young woman who'd hidden among textile bales during her desperate flight from Hartford. She was becoming someone new, a skilled professional, an independent woman, a person whose value was measured by her contributions rather than her limitations. The transformation was just beginning. The December wind howled through the streets of Springfield, carrying with it the first heavy snowfall of the winter season. Elena Morrison pulled her wool shawl tighter as she navigated the familiar path from her apartment to the mill, her boots crunching through the accumulating snow that had transformed the industrial landscape into something almost magical. 3 months had passed since her arrival in Springfield, and the rhythms of her new life had become as natural as breathing. She paused at the intersection of Mill Street and River Avenue, listening to the muffled sounds of the city waking under its blanket of snow. The familiar clatter of horse hooves moved more slowly this morning, their usual sharp percussion softened by the weather. Somewhere behind her, she could hear children's voices raised in excitement as they discovered the transformed world outside their windows. Elena smiled at the sound, remembering her own childhood wonder at the first snow each year. Before the fever took her sight, she had spent hours watching snowflakes dance past windows, marveling at their intricate patterns. Now she experienced snow differently, through the hushed quality it brought to familiar sounds, the way it changed, the texture of air against her skin, the clean scent that replaced the usual industrial odors of the mill district. Her reverie was interrupted by rapid footsteps approaching from behind, someone moving with urgency despite the treacherous footing. Elena tensed, her mind immediately jumping to the possibility that Theodore had finally tracked her to Springfield. The footsteps slowed as they drew near, and a man's voice called out her name. "Miss Morrison? Elena Morrison?" The voice was unfamiliar, with a slight German accent that suggested one of Springfield's growing immigrant population. Elena turned toward the sound, her hand instinctively moving to the small knife she'd taken to carrying since her arrival, a precaution that Mrs. O'Brien had insisted upon for a young woman living alone. "Yes," Elena replied carefully, not confirming her identity but not denying it either. "My name is Klaus Brennan," the man said, his breathing labored from his hurried pursuit. "I operate a small furniture workshop on Chestnut Street. I've been hoping to speak with you about my son." Elena relaxed slightly at the mention of a child, though she remained cautious. "What about your son, Mr. Brennan?" "Perhaps we could speak somewhere warmer," Klaus suggested. "There's a coffee house just ahead, and what I have to tell you deserves privacy." Elena hesitated, weighing her options. The morning was bitter cold, and she was curious about what this stranger wanted to discuss regarding his son. But agreeing to accompany an unknown man went against every safety lesson she'd learned since achieving her independence. "I understand your caution," Klaus said, apparently reading her hesitation correctly. "My wife, Anna, operates the coffee house I mentioned. She's expecting us, and there will be other customers present. You'll be perfectly safe." The mention of his wife and other witnesses eased Elena's concerns enough to agree. Klaus offered his arm to help her navigate the snowy sidewalk, and she accepted the assistance while remaining alert to her surroundings. The coffee house was indeed just a block away, its windows glowing warmly against the grey morning and the scent of freshly baked bread drifting from its doorway. Inside, the warmth enveloped Elena like an embrace. She could hear the quiet conversations of perhaps a dozen customers, the gentle clink of china cups and the hiss of steam from what was probably a coffee machine. A woman's voice greeted them from behind what sounded like a service counter. "Klaus, you found her. Miss Morrison, I'm Anna Brennan. Please sit wherever you're comfortable." Elena allowed Klaus to guide her to a table near the back of the establishment, away from the other customers, but still within the safety of their presence. Anna appeared at their table almost immediately, setting down what smelled like hot coffee and fresh pastries. "Now," Anna said, settling into the third chair at their table, "Klaus has been working up the courage to approach you for weeks. Tell her about Michael, dear." Klaus cleared his throat nervously. "Miss Morrison, my son Michael is 8 years old, and he lost his sight in an accident this past summer. A piece of metal flew from my workshop and struck him in the face. The doctors did everything they could, but—" Elena's heart clenched with sympathy and understanding. She could imagine the family's devastation, the confusion and fear that must have followed such a sudden transformation of their child's world. "I'm very sorry," Eleanor said softly. "That must have been terrible for all of you." "The physical healing went well," Anna continued, her voice thick with maternal worry. "But Michael has struggled with adjusting to his new circumstances. He barely speaks anymore, refuses to leave his room, won't let us teach him how to navigate the house safely. The doctor says there's nothing physically preventing him from learning to live normally, but he seems to have given up hope." Klaus leaned forward, his voice urgent. "We've heard about your work at the mill, Miss Morrison. About how you've succeeded despite your blindness, how you've found ways to use your other senses that actually make you better at your job than sighted workers. Michael needs to see that blindness doesn't mean his life is over." Elena understood immediately why they'd sought her out. Michael needed to see proof that a full life was possible without sight. But more than that, he needed guidance from someone who truly understood the challenges he faced. "I'd be happy to meet Michael," Elena said, "but I should warn you that helping him won't be simple or quick. Learning to navigate the world without sight is difficult enough, but overcoming the emotional trauma of sudden blindness is even more challenging." "We understand," Anna said quickly. "We're not expecting miracles. We just want Michael to believe that his future can still hold possibility." Eleanor found herself thinking of her own adjustment period after losing her sight, the months of rage and despair that her mother had patiently endured. But Elena had been 7 when the fever took her vision, young enough to adapt more easily than an 8-year-old who had already formed clear ideas about what life should look like. "When would you like me to meet him?" Elena asked. "Could you come this afternoon?" Klaus asked hopefully. "We live above the coffee house, and Michael spends most of his time in his room. Perhaps if you simply talked to him, shared some of your own experiences." Elena agreed to return after her workday ended, and the Brennans provided detailed directions to help her find their residence above the coffee house. As she walked to the mill through the continuing snowfall, Elena found herself both anticipating and dreading the afternoon's encounter. She wanted to help Michael, but she also worried about her ability to reach a child who had retreated so completely from the world. Her workday at the mill passed quickly, filled with the usual quality assessments and consultations that had become routine over the past 3 months. But Elena found her mind frequently drifting to Michael Brennan, wondering what approach might break through the wall of despair that his parents had described. When her shift ended, Elena made her way back to the coffee house, which had closed for the day but still smelled of the morning's baking. Klaus met her at a side entrance that led to a narrow staircase, guiding her up to the family's living quarters above the business. The apartment was warm and comfortable, filled with the scents of wood shavings from Klaus's workshop and the lingering aroma of Anna's cooking. But Elena also detected an undertone of sadness, the particular quality that grief brings to a household's atmosphere. "Michael's room is just down the hall," Anna whispered as they climbed the stairs. "He knows you're coming, but he hasn't responded to anything we've said about it." Elena nodded, understanding that the boy's silence was likely a form of self-protection rather than defiance. She followed Anna down a short hallway to a closed door, behind which she could hear no sound at all. "Michael?" Anna called softly, knocking gently on the door. Miss Morrison is here to visit with you. Silence. May I go in? Elena asked. Anna opened the door, revealing a small bedroom that felt empty despite being occupied. Elena could sense Michael's presence in the room, but he made no sound or movement to acknowledge their arrival. "Hello, Michael," Elena said, settling into what felt like a chair near the door. "My name is Elena. Your parents thought we might have some things in common." Still no response, but Elena detected the slightest shift in the boy's breathing that suggested he was listening despite his silence. "I lost my sight when I was 7, Elena continued conversationally. "A fever made me very sick, and when I got better the world had gone dark. I was furious about it for a long time." Elena paused, letting the words settle. She'd learned that rushing conversations with traumatized individuals often drove them deeper into their protective silence. "I threw things," Elena said after a moment. "Screamed at my mother when she tried to help me. Refused to eat because I was angry that I couldn't see my food. I must have been quite a terror to live with." This time, Elena heard a soft intake of breath that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly stifled. "The worst part wasn't the darkness itself," Elena continued. "It was feeling like everything I'd planned to do with my life had become impossible. I'd wanted to be a teacher, you see, and everyone told me that blind people couldn't teach. I believed them for a while." Elena settled more comfortably in her chair, sensing that Michael was beginning to listen more actively, despite his continued silence. "It took me a long time to learn that most people don't understand what blindness actually means," Elena said. "They think it makes you helpless, but that's only true if you believe it yourself. I had to discover that my hands could learn to see in ways that eyes never could." Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a piece of fabric she'd brought from the mill, one of the complex weaves that required her particular expertise to assess properly. "Would you like to feel something interesting?" Elena asked, extending the fabric toward the bed where she sensed Michael was sitting. After a long pause, she felt small fingers tentatively touch the cloth she offered. Michael's hand was warm but trembling slightly, and Elena could sense the effort it took for him to reach out even this small amount. "This is silk thread woven with cotton," Elena explained as Michael explored the fabric's texture. "Can you feel how the two materials are different? The silk is smoother, but the cotton has more texture." Michael's fingers moved more confidently across the fabric, and Elena heard him draw a small, sharp breath as he discovered the subtle differences she'd described. "At my job, I examine fabrics like this to find problems that even sighted workers miss," Elena said. "My fingers can detect flaws that are too small to see easily. It's like having a superpower that other people don't possess." "Superpower?" Michael spoke for the first time, his voice rusty from disuse, but carrying a note of cautious interest. "Absolutely," Elena replied seriously. "When you can't rely on your eyes, your other senses become much stronger. You'll be able to hear things other people miss, feel details they can't detect, even smell and taste with more sensitivity than you had before." Michael was quiet for a moment, but Elena could sense him processing this information. "Everything feels different now," he said finally. "Food doesn't taste right, and I bump into things, and I can't tell where I am." "That's normal," Elena assured him. "Your brain is learning to work in a new way, and that takes time. It's like learning to walk all over again. But instead of using your legs differently, you're using your whole mind differently." Elena spent the next hour with Michael, sharing stories of her own adjustment period and demonstrating some of the techniques she'd learned for navigating safely without sight. She showed him how to use sound to judge distances, how to trail his hand along walls to maintain orientation, and how to organize his belongings so he could always find what he needed. Most importantly, she listened as Michael began to share his own fears and frustrations. He was afraid that other children would treat him differently, worried that he'd never be able to play the games he'd enjoyed before, and devastated by the belief that his accident had ruined his parents' lives as well as his own. "Your parents love you," Elena said firmly when Michael expressed this last fear. "Your blindness doesn't change that, and it doesn't make you a burden to them. They're worried about you, but that's because they love you, not because they see you as a problem to solve." When Elena finally left the Brennan household that evening, Michael had agreed to let his parents help him learn to navigate their apartment safely. It was a small step, but Elena recognized it as significant progress from the complete withdrawal his parents had described. Over the following weeks, Elena began visiting Michael regularly, usually in the evenings after her work at the mill. She taught him practical skills like organizing his belongings, moving safely through familiar spaces, and beginning to develop the heightened sensory awareness that would become his new way of understanding the world. But more importantly, Eleanor provided Michael with proof that blindness didn't have to mean the end of dreams or possibilities. She brought him samples from the mill to examine, teaching him to identify different materials and qualities by touch. She described her work and her independent life, painting a picture of adulthood that included meaningful contribution and personal satisfaction. Michael's progress was gradual but steady. He began leaving his room regularly, started learning to help with simple tasks around the coffee house, and most significantly, began talking about things he wanted to do in the future. His parents watched this transformation with amazement and gratitude that they expressed to Elena every time they saw her. "You've given us our son back," Anna said one evening, as Elena prepared to leave after a particularly successful session with Michael. "We can never repay what you've done for our family." Elena felt a deep satisfaction in Michael's progress, but helping him had also revealed something important about her own growth since arriving in Springfield. The frightened young woman who had fled Hartford in a freight wagon had become someone capable of guiding others through their own darkness, someone whose experiences could provide hope and practical assistance to those facing similar challenges. But Elena's expanding role in Springfield's community also made her more visible, and visibility carried risks. One snowy evening in late December, as she walked home from the Brennan coffee house, Elena became aware of footsteps following her through the quiet streets. The steps matched her pace too precisely to be coincidental, speeding up when she walked, faster and slowing when she paused to listen. Her heart began to race as she realized that her months of peaceful anonymity in Springfield might be coming to an end. Theodore had resources and legal authority that could reach across state lines, and her growing reputation in the community made her easier to locate for anyone determined to find her. Elena quickened her pace toward her apartment building, but the following footsteps quickened as well. Behind her, she heard a man clear his throat, and a familiar voice called out through the winter air, "Elena Morrison, I think it's time we had a conversation." Elena's blood turned to ice as she recognized the voice of Josiah Crane, the labor contractor who had tried to purchase her from Theodore 3 months earlier. His presence in Springfield meant that her stepfather had indeed tracked her down, and that the life she'd built here was about to face its greatest threat yet. Elena's breath formed white clouds in the frigid December air as she stood frozen. On the snow-covered sidewalk, every muscle in her body tense with the recognition of danger. Josiah Crane's voice carried the same smooth confidence she remembered from that horrible night in Theodore's parlor, but now it held an additional edge of satisfaction, like a hunter who had finally cornered his prey after a long pursuit. "Don't think about running, Miss Morrison," Crane said, his footsteps crunching closer through the snow. "I know these streets better than you do, and there's nowhere you can go that I can't follow." Elena's mind raced through her options. Her apartment building was still 2 blocks away, too far to reach safely if Crane intended to physically prevent her escape. The mill district was largely deserted at this hour, with most workers having returned to their homes for the evening. Even screaming for help might go unheard in the muffled quiet that the snowfall had brought to the neighborhood. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, turning to face Crane's voice while keeping her body angled toward what she hoped was the direction of the nearest cross street. "You know exactly what I want," Crane replied. "You violated a legal contract when you fled Hartford. Theodore Blackwood has every right to demand your return, and I'm here to ensure that happens." Elena's heart sank as she realized the implications of Crane's words. Theodore hadn't simply reported her as a runaway. He'd apparently convinced local authorities that she was bound by some form of legal obligation that gave him the right to retrieve her against her will. "There was no contract," Elena said firmly. "I never signed anything, and I refused your offer explicitly." Crane's laugh was cold and humorless. "Legal technicalities, Miss Morrison. Your stepfather has guardianship authority over you until you marry or reach the age of 21. That gives him the right to make employment decisions on your behalf, whether you agree with them or not." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. She'd known that Theodore retained legal authority over her, but she'd hoped that her physical distance from Connecticut would make that authority difficult to enforce. Crane's presence proved that hope had been naive. "The authorities in Springfield have been quite cooperative," Crane continued conversationally. "Once I explained that you were a runaway ward who had fled a legal guardianship, they were very understanding about the need to return you to proper supervision." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists inside her mittens. The word supervision made her status clear. In the eyes of the law, she remained Theodore's property, no different from a piece of furniture or livestock that had been temporarily misplaced. "I have work here," Elena said, grasping for any argument that might carry legal weight. "Employment with Mr. Whitman at the textile mill. I'm a contributing member of this community." "Unauthorized employment obtained through fraudulent means," Crane countered smoothly. "You had no legal right to sign an employment contract without your guardian's permission. Mr. Whitman has been informed of the situation and agrees that the arrangement must be terminated." Eleanor's heart lurched at this news. Whitman had been her lifeline, the person who'd seen her potential and given her the opportunity to prove her worth. If he'd truly agreed to terminate her employment, it meant she'd lost not just her job, but also her most powerful ally in Springfield. "Mr. Whitman agreed to this?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Reluctantly, but yes," Crane said. "Business owners can't afford to harbor runaway wards, no matter how skilled they might be. The legal complications alone make it impossible." Eleanor felt the world tilting around her, the life she'd built in Springfield crumbling like sand. Without Whitman's support and protection, she had no legal standing to resist Theodore's demands. She was about to become once again a commodity to be transferred according to other people's wishes. "However," Crane continued, his tone shifting to something that might have been meant as conciliatory, "the situation isn't entirely hopeless. The Morrison family in Albany remains interested in your services, despite the complications your flight has caused. They're prepared to overlook your rebellion in exchange for a longer contract term and additional guarantees of compliance." Eleanor understood the implications immediately. The Morrison family wanted insurance against future escapes, which meant conditions that would make independent action impossible. Probably a remote location, limited contact with the outside world, and legal agreements that would bind her more tightly than anything Theodore had originally planned. "And if I refuse?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Then your guardian has other options," Crane said. "The Connecticut Hospital for the Insane has facilities for individuals whose blindness has led to emotional instability. Theodore has medical testimony suggesting that your flight from Hartford demonstrates an inability to make rational decisions about your own welfare. The threat was clear and devastating. If Elena refused to accept the Morrison family contract, Theodore could have her committed to an asylum on the grounds that her blindness had made her mentally incompetent. Once institutionalized, she would have no legal rights whatsoever and no possibility of appeal or escape. Elena's hands trembled as the full scope of her situation became clear. Theodore and Crane had constructed a legal trap that gave her only two choices: accept indentured servitude with the Morrison family or face commitment to an asylum where she would disappear entirely from the world of law and society. I need time to consider this, Elena said, stalling, while her mind searched desperately for any third option. I'm afraid that's not possible, Crane replied. The legal papers have already been filed with local authorities. You're to come with me tonight for transport back to Connecticut tomorrow morning. Eleanor heard the finality in his voice and realized that the conversation had been mere formality. Crane hadn't come to negotiate or persuade. He'd come to collect property that belonged to his client. Her opinions and preferences were no more relevant than those of a horse being led back to its stable. But as Elena stood in the falling snow, feeling the weight of legal authority crushing down upon her, she heard something that gave her a spark of hope. Footsteps were approaching from the direction of the mill district, moving with purpose despite the treacherous footing. Multiple sets of footsteps, suggesting a group of people rather than a single individual. Miss Morrison? A familiar voice called through the snow. Is everything all right? Elena's heart leaped as she recognized Samuel Crawford's gruff tones. The mill supervisor was approaching with what sounded like several other people, their voices carrying concern and something that might have been anger. Mr. Crawford, Eleanor called back, her voice shaking with relief. I'm here, but there's a problem. Crawford and his companions reached Elena's position within moments, and she could sense their attention focusing on Crane with the kind of hostile scrutiny that working men reserved for people they identified as threats to their community. This is Josiah Crane, Elena said quickly, before the situation could escalate into something dangerous. He's here on behalf of my stepfather to retrieve me. Retrieve you? Crawford's voice carried disbelief and growing anger. You're not a piece of lost property, Miss Morrison. Actually, Crane interjected smoothly, Miss Morrison is a ward under legal guardianship who fled her assigned placement without authorization. I have proper documentation authorizing her return to Connecticut. Eleanor heard the rustle of papers as Crane produced what were presumably the legal documents supporting his claim. But she also heard something else, the quiet murmur of voices as Crawford and his companions discussed the situation among themselves. Miss Morrison, Crawford said after a moment, Klaus Brennan told us you were helping his boy Michael learn to manage his blindness. That true? Elena nodded, puzzled by the seemingly irrelevant question. Yes, I've been working with Michael to help him adjust to losing his sight. And that work's been making a real difference, Crawford pressed. The boy's been getting better because of your help? Yes, Eleanor said, still confused about where Crawford was leading with his questions. Crawford was quiet for a moment, then addressed Crane directly. Mr. Crane, you said Miss Morrison's employment with the mill was unauthorized and had to be terminated. That true? Completely accurate, Crane replied confidently. Mr. Whitman confirmed that the arrangement was legally invalid. Interesting, Crawford said thoughtfully, because I just came from a meeting with Mr. Whitman, and he never mentioned anything about terminating Miss Morrison's employment. In fact, he specifically asked me to check on her this evening because he was concerned about some strangers who'd been asking questions about her around town. Elena's heart began to race as she realized that Crane had been lying about Whitman's cooperation. Her employer hadn't abandoned her, he'd been trying to protect her from whatever threat the strangers represented. Furthermore, Crawford continued, his voice growing harder, we've been talking to people around the neighborhood about Miss Morrison's work here in Springfield. Turns out she's been helping quite a few folks beyond just her job at the mill. Elena heard more voices joining the group, and she recognized several of them. Anna Brennan's worried tones, Mrs. O'Brien from the company store, Margaret Sullivan from the spinning floor, and others whose names she didn't know, but whose voices carried the warmth of people who considered her part of their community. Miss Morrison's been teaching Michael how to live with his blindness, Klaus Brennan said firmly. My boy was ready to give up on life until she showed him what was possible. That's not the work of someone who's mentally unstable or needs supervision. She spots quality problems that our regular inspectors miss, Margaret added. Saves the mill money every week with her assessments. That's skilled professional work, not something a person does if they can't think straight. Elena felt tears beginning to freeze on her cheeks as she realized what was happening. The community she'd found in Springfield was rallying to protect her, not because they pitied her blindness, but because they valued her contributions and saw her as one of their own. This is all very touching, Crane said, his smooth confidence finally showing some cracks, but it doesn't change the legal realities. Miss Morrison is a ward under guardianship, and that guardianship gives her stepfather authority over her. Placement and employment. Maybe so, Crawford replied, but guardianship doesn't give him the right to lie about her mental state or make false claims about her employment. You told Miss Morrison that Mr. Whitman had agreed to terminate her job. That was a lie. Crane was silent for a moment, apparently realizing that his deception had been exposed. The details of the employment termination are still being finalized, he said carefully. And you told her that she'd have to choose between this Morrison family contract and commitment to an asylum, Anna Brennan added. That sounds like coercion to me, using threats to force compliance. Eleanor could hear the uncertainty creeping into Crane's voice as he found himself facing organized opposition rather than the isolated, frightened young woman he'd expected to intimidate into compliance. The legal authority remains clear, Crane insisted, but his tone had lost its earlier confidence. Miss Morrison must return to Connecticut to resolve her legal status properly. Then she'll return voluntarily, with proper legal representation, Crawford said firmly, not as a captive being transported against her will, and she'll return knowing that she has a community here that values her work and wants her back. Elena felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the physical cold of the winter evening. For the first time since Crane had confronted her, she felt like she had allies rather than facing the situation alone. Mr. Crane, Elena said, finding her voice stronger than it had been since the confrontation began, I'll return to Connecticut, voluntarily to address the legal issues around my guardianship, but I won't be signing any contracts with the Morrison family or anyone else until I've had proper legal counsel. Crane was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing his options. The group of Springfield residents surrounding him made it clear that any attempt to force Elena's immediate departure would face significant resistance, and his deceptions about Whitman's cooperation had undermined his credibility. Very well, Crane said finally, but understand that your guardianship status remains unchanged until resolved through proper legal channels. Your stepfather retains authority over your decisions until that authority is legally terminated. We understand, Crawford replied before Elena could respond, but Miss Morrison will be returning with people who can ensure she receives fair treatment and proper representation. She won't be facing this alone. As the group began to disperse, with various community members making plans to accompany Elena to Connecticut or provide other forms of support, Elena felt a profound shift in her understanding of her own situation. She was no longer the frightened runaway who had hidden among textile bales during her escape from Hartford. She had become someone whose loss would be felt by an entire community, someone whose value was recognized and defended by people who barely knew her 3 months earlier. The legal challenges ahead remained daunting. Theodore's guardianship authority was real, and overturning it would require resources and expertise that Elena didn't possess. But she would no longer face those challenges as an isolated individual whose voice could be easily silenced. As the snow continued to fall on the Springfield streets, Eleanor Morrison prepared for the most important battle of her life, the fight to prove that her blindness didn't disqualify her from determining her own future. And for the first time since losing her sight 12 years earlier, she wasn't facing that battle alone. The confrontation with Crane had ended, but Eleanor knew it was only the beginning of a larger struggle that would determine whether she could claim the independence she'd worked so hard to build, or whether she would be forced back into the role of helpless ward that Theodore and society expected her to accept. But now, she had something she'd never possessed before, a community of people who believed in her worth and were willing to fight for her right to prove it. That support would be tested in the days ahead, but it had already transformed Elena from a victim into someone who could face her challenges with dignity and hope. The real confrontation was yet to come, but Elena Morrison was no longer facing it as the powerless young woman who'd been sold by her stepfather months earlier. She was facing it as a skilled professional, a valued community member, and most importantly, as someone who had learned to see her own worth clearly, despite the darkness that surrounded her. The train whistle's mournful wail echoed across the Connecticut countryside as Elena Morrison pressed her face against the cold window of the passenger car, her breath fogging the glass despite her inability to see the landscape rushing past. 3 weeks had passed since Crane's confrontation in Springfield. 3 weeks of careful preparation for this moment when she would face Theodore and the legal system that had given him power over her life. But Elena was not returning to Hartford as the same frightened young woman who had fled in a freight wagon 4 months earlier. Beside her sat attorney Benjamin Marshall, a sharp-minded lawyer from Boston whom Cornelius Whitman had hired to represent her interests. Across the aisle, Samuel Crawford dozed fitfully, having insisted on accompanying Eleanor despite the financial hardship the trip represented for a mill supervisor with a family to support. Most remarkably, in the seat behind her, 8-year-old Michael Brennan chattered excitedly with his parents about his first train journey. The boy, who had refused to leave his room just weeks earlier, was now navigating the world with growing confidence, his recovery serving as living proof of Elena's positive impact on her community. "Miss Morrison," Attorney Marshall said quietly, leaning toward her seat, "I want to review our strategy once more before we reach Hartford. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning, and Judge Caldwell has a reputation for strict interpretation of guardianship law." Eleanor nodded, her stomach tight with anxiety despite the weeks of preparation. Marshall had explained that overturning Theodore's guardianship would require proving either that she had reached the mental and financial competence to manage her own affairs, or that Theodore had abused his authority in ways that violated his legal obligations as her guardian. "The key evidence will be your employment record in Springfield," Marshall continued. "We have documentation of your wages, your professional responsibilities, and testimonials from supervisors about your competence. That establishes your financial capability and mental acuity." Elena had memorized these arguments during their preparation sessions, but hearing them again helped calm her nerves. Elena Morrison, who had worked successfully at Whitman Mills, who had helped Michael Brennan recover from his trauma, who had earned the respect and support of an entire community, that Elena had rights that the law would have to recognize. "We also have evidence of Theodore's attempt to sell you to the Morrison family without your consent," Marshall added. Guardianship law requires that placement decisions be made in the ward's best interest, not for the guardian's financial benefit. If we can prove Theodore was prioritizing his own welfare over yours, that constitutes grounds for terminating his authority. Behind them, Michael's bright voice carried over the train's rhythmic clacking. Miss Elena, when we get to Hartford, can we visit the mill where you used to work? I want to feel the different kinds of thread you told me about. Elena smiled despite her anxiety. Michael's enthusiasm reminded her that she was fighting not just for her own freedom, but for the principle that blindness didn't disqualify someone from living a full and independent life. If she lost this battle, the message would echo beyond her own circumstances to affect others facing similar challenges. We'll see what time allows, Michael, Elena replied. First, we have some legal business to attend to. The train began to slow as it approached Hartford, and Elena felt her heart rate increase with each decrease in speed. Somewhere in this city, Theodore was probably preparing his own case, marshalling whatever arguments and evidence he could to maintain control over her life and financial situation. As the train pulled into Hartford's Grand Union Station, Elena was struck by how different her arrival felt compared to her departure months earlier. Then she had been a refugee fleeing in secret. Now she was returning with allies, legal representation, and a clear record of her own competence and value. Marshall had arranged lodging at the Whitmore Hotel, a respectable establishment near the courthouse that could accommodate their entire group. As they made their way through the station's bustling crowds, Elena noticed how naturally Michael navigated the unfamiliar environment, using his cane and the techniques she had taught him to move confidently despite his recent blindness. He's remarkable, Crawford observed, watching Michael guide himself around obstacles while maintaining conversation with his parents. 3 months ago, his family thought his life was over. Now look at him. Eleanor felt a surge of pride in Michael's progress, but also a deep awareness of how much was at stake in tomorrow's hearing. If Theodore successfully maintained his guardianship, he could prevent her from returning to Springfield and continuing the work that had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of others, like Michael. The Whitmore Hotel's lobby buzzed with afternoon activity as guests checked in and bellhops carried luggage across the marble floors. Elena found the familiar sounds of a busy hotel comforting after the uncertainty of travel, and she was grateful when Marshall efficiently handled the check-in process that would have been complicated for her to manage alone. "Miss Morrison," the desk clerk said as Marshall completed the paperwork, "there's a message here for you, delivered this morning by hand." Eleanor's stomach dropped as Marshall read the message aloud. It was from Theodore, brief and coldly formal. "Elena, you will present yourself at my residence this evening at 7 o'clock to discuss tomorrow's proceedings. Your defiance has caused enough disruption. Do not compound your mistakes with further rebellion." "You're not going," Crawford said immediately. "That's obviously an attempt to intimidate or coerce you before the hearing." Marshall nodded in agreement. "Any communication with your stepfather should happen through legal channels or in the presence of counsel. A private meeting could only work against your interests." Eleanor appreciated their protective instincts, but she also recognized an opportunity in Theodore's demand. "What if I did meet with him, but with you present, Mr. Marshall? If Theodore is feeling pressured about tomorrow's hearing, he might reveal information that could help our case." Marshall considered this suggestion carefully. "It's risky," he said finally. "But if you're willing to face that discomfort, it might indeed provide insights into his strategy or state of mind." They spent the remainder of the afternoon in Elena's hotel room, reviewing legal documents and preparing for various scenarios they might encounter during the hearing. Marshall had obtained copies of Theodore's guardianship petition and supporting documents, which revealed the extent of his legal maneuvering. "He's claiming that your flight to Springfield demonstrates mental instability and poor judgment," Marshall explained. His argument is that a competent person would have accepted the Morrison family placement rather than fleeing to uncertain circumstances. Elena felt anger rising in her chest at Theodore's characterization of her choices. So seeking meaningful employment and independence is evidence of mental illness. According to his filing, yes, Marshall replied grimly. He's also arguing that your blindness makes you inherently vulnerable to exploitation and manipulation, requiring ongoing supervision for your own protection. The twisted logic of Theodore's arguments made Elena's hands clench into fists. He was using her blindness as evidence that she couldn't make rational decisions, while simultaneously trying to force her into situations that were genuinely exploitative and harmful. At 7 o'clock, Eleanor and Marshall made their way to Theodore's house on Maple Street, a journey that brought back vivid memories of Elena's life before Springfield. The familiar landmarks, the loose board on the porch steps, the creaking front door, the smell of tobacco and neglect, transported her back to the helpless young woman she had been just months earlier. Theodore answered the door himself, his voice carrying the same cold authority Elena remembered. "Elena, you look well. Marshall, I assume." "Attorney Marshall," the lawyer corrected firmly. "I'm here to represent Miss Morrison's interests in any discussions." Theodore led them into the same parlor where Crane had presented the Morrison family contract, and Elena felt the weight of that memory pressing down on her. But this time, she was not alone and frightened. She had legal representation, community support, and most importantly, a clear sense of her own worth and capabilities. "Elena," Theodore began without preamble, "this entire situation has become unnecessarily complicated. You've embarrassed our family with your dramatic flight, involved strangers in our private business, and now you're wasting money on lawyers for a battle you cannot win." Elena straightened in her chair, meeting Theodore's implicit gaze directly. "I didn't flee to embarrass anyone. I left to escape being sold to people I'd never met for work I'd never agreed to do." "Sold?" Theodore's voice rose with indignation. "I arranged appropriate employment that would provide you with security and supervision suited to your limitations. The Morrison family offered generous terms for someone in your condition." Marshall leaned forward, his voice professionally calm. "Mr. Blackwood, the contract you attempted to arrange with the Morrison family was essentially indentured servitude. Miss Morrison would have had no rights, no recourse if mistreated, and no opportunity to leave if the situation proved unsuitable." Elena felt her temper flaring at Theodore's casual dismissal of her achievements, but she forced herself to remain calm. "My blindness is not a disability that prevents independent living," she said. "It's a difference that requires adaptation, but it doesn't eliminate my right to make my own choices." "Rights?" Theodore's voice dripped with disdain. "You have the right to be protected from your own poor judgment, running away to live alone in a strange city, trusting strangers, taking unnecessary risks. These are not the actions of someone capable of self-governance." Marshall reached into his briefcase and withdrew several letters. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, we have extensive documentation of Miss Morrison's positive impact in Springfield. Letters from supervisors, community members, and families she's helped. She's been teaching other blind individuals to navigate independence successfully." Elena watched Theodore's expression change as Marshall read excerpts from the letters, Crawford's assessment of her professional competence, Anna Brennan's gratitude for Michael's recovery, Mrs. O'Brien's testimony about Elena's responsible management of household affairs. "This is all very touching," Theodore said when Marshall finished, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "However, the law doesn't change based on sentimental testimonials. Elena remains a blind woman who requires supervision and protection." Elena stood up, her movement deliberate and controlled. The law also doesn't allow guardians to profit from selling their wards into indentured servitude, she said. Mr. Marshall has evidence that you received payment from Crane for arranging the Morrison family contract. Theodore's face flushed red, and for the first time during the conversation, he seemed genuinely rattled. Any fees were legitimate compensation for my time and efforts in arranging suitable placement, he said quickly. Placement that Miss Morrison explicitly refused, Marshall pointed out, which suggests that your primary concern was financial benefit rather than her welfare. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Theodore's mantel clock. Elena could sense the shift in power dynamics, the way Theodore's certainty was beginning to crack under the weight of evidence and legal scrutiny. Finally, Theodore spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "What exactly do you want, Elena?" Elena had prepared for this moment, had rehearsed the words that would define her future relationship with the man who had treated her as property to be disposed of. "I want legal recognition of my right to self-determination," Elena said clearly. "I want the court to terminate your guardianship and acknowledge my competence to manage my own affairs. I want to return to Springfield and continue building a life based on my abilities rather than others' assumptions about my limitations." Theodore was quiet for a long moment, apparently weighing his options. "And if I contest this in court tomorrow?" "Then we'll present all our evidence," Marshall replied. "Miss Morrison's employment record, financial responsibility, community contributions, and the circumstances surrounding her departure from your guardianship. The court will decide whether her actions demonstrate competence or instability." Elena felt her heart racing as the conversation reached its crucial point. Theodore could agree to some form of compromise that would allow her to return to Springfield, or he could force a complete legal battle that would determine not just her own future, but potentially set precedent for other blind individuals seeking independence. "I need time to consider my options," Theodore said finally, his voice betraying the uncertainty Elena had never heard from him before. "The hearing is at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning," Marshall said. "Whatever you decide, we'll be prepared to present Miss Morrison's case for independence." As they left Theodore's house, Elena felt emotionally drained, but also strangely hopeful. The man who had once seemed all-powerful in her life had appeared uncertain, even defensive, when confronted with evidence of her competence and his own questionable motives. "How do you think it went?" Elena asked Marshall as they walked back toward the hotel. "Better than I expected," Marshall replied thoughtfully. "Your stepfather seemed genuinely surprised by the strength of our case. He may decide that agreeing to voluntary termination of guardianship is preferable to a public hearing that could expose his financial motivations." Elena hoped Marshall was right, but she also prepared herself for the possibility that Theodore would fight to maintain control out of pride or stubbornness rather than rational calculation. Back at the hotel, the Brennan family and Crawford were waiting anxiously for news of the meeting. Michael immediately approached Elena, his young face bright with curiosity. "Miss Elena, how did it go? Did you tell your stepfather about all the good work you're doing?" Elena knelt down to Michael's level, taking his small hands in hers. "I told him about my job and about how I've been helping you learn to be independent. Tomorrow, a judge will decide whether I get to keep doing that work." Michael's expression grew serious beyond his 8 years. "You have to win," he said firmly, "because if you can't be independent, then maybe I can't either when I grow up." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes as she realized the larger implications of her legal battle. She wasn't just fighting for her own freedom, she was fighting for the principle that blind individuals could claim full participation in society rather than accepting lives of supervised dependency. "We're going to do everything we can," Elena promised Michael, And whatever happens, you remember that your blindness doesn't limit what you can achieve if you're willing to work for it. As the evening wore on, Elena found herself surrounded by people who believed in her worth and capability. Their support gave her strength for the challenge ahead, but she knew that ultimately tomorrow's hearing would come down to a simple question: whether the legal system would recognize her right to determine her own future, or whether her blindness would continue to be used as justification for treating her as less than fully human. The battle for Eleanor Morrison's independence would be decided in a Connecticut courtroom, but its implications would reach far beyond her individual circumstances to touch the lives of countless others who faced similar struggles for recognition and respect. Tomorrow would determine whether courage and competence could triumph over prejudice and legal tradition. Elena fell asleep that night knowing she had done everything possible to prepare for that confrontation, surrounded by allies who had transformed her from an isolated victim into someone fighting not just for herself, but for the principle that every person deserved the chance to prove their worth. The Hartford County Courthouse stood like a monument to justice in the crisp January morning light, its granite steps gleaming with frost that crunched under the feet of early arrivals. Elena Morrison climbed those steps with deliberate care, her hand resting lightly on Attorney Marshall's arm, while her heart hammered against her ribs with anticipation that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Behind them, Samuel Crawford's boots echoed solidly on the stone, and she could hear Michael Brennan's excited whispers to his parents as the 8-year-old experienced his first visit to a courthouse. The boy, who had once refused to leave his bedroom, was now eager to witness the legal proceeding that would determine whether Elena could continue helping children like him achieve independence despite their blindness. Courtroom B is on the second floor, Marshall said quietly as they entered the building's marble-floored lobby. Judge Caldwell typically begins proceedings promptly at 9 o'clock, so we'll want to be seated and prepared well before then. Elena nodded, though her mind was racing through the arguments they'd rehearsed over the past 3 weeks. Everything depended on convincing Judge Caldwell that her blindness was not evidence of incompetence, but simply a different way of navigating the world that could be accommodated without surrendering her fundamental rights to self-determination. The courtroom itself was smaller than Elena had imagined, with wooden benches that creaked under the weight of spectators and tall windows that let in the winter morning light. She could hear voices conversing in hushed tones as other cases were discussed, and the rustle of papers as attorneys prepared their arguments. "Miss Morrison," a familiar voice called from across the room, and Elena's stomach tightened as she recognized Josiah Crane's smooth tones. "I trust you've had time to reconsider the generous offer from the Morrison family. It's not too late to resolve this matter amicably." Marshall stepped slightly forward, his voice professionally cool. "Mr. Crane, any communication with my client should go through me, and Miss Morrison has no intention of accepting any arrangement that would compromise her independence." Elena felt a surge of gratitude for Marshall's protection, but she also wanted to face Crane directly rather than hide behind her attorney's intervention. "Mr. Crane," she said, turning toward his voice, "I've found meaningful work and a supportive community in Springfield. I have no interest in any contract that would take me away from that life." Crane's laugh carried the same condescending tone that had infuriated Elena during their confrontation in Springfield. "Miss Morrison, your Springfield adventure has been an interesting experiment, but real life requires more stability than charity employment can provide. The Morrison family offers genuine security." "Security," Michael Brennan's young voice piped up unexpectedly. "Miss Elena doesn't need security from other people. She teaches people like me how to be secure on our own." Elena heard Klaus Brennan's gentle remonstrance to his son about speaking out of turn, But she also detected the pride in his voice. Michael's innocent observation had cut straight to the heart of the philosophical difference between Elena's vision of her future and Theodore's paternalistic control. "All rise." The bailiff's voice boomed through the courtroom, the Honorable Judge Reginald Caldwell presiding. Elena stood with the rest of the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she heard the judge's robes rustling and his gavel tapping against the wooden bench. This was the moment that would determine whether her months of building an independent life in Springfield had been a temporary reprieve or the beginning of permanent freedom. "Be seated." Judge Caldwell's voice carried the authority of decades on the bench. "This morning, we're hearing the matter of Morrison versus Blackwood, a petition for termination of guardianship. Attorney Marshall, you're representing the petitioner?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marshall replied, rising to address the court. "Elena Morrison seeks termination of the guardianship established by her stepfather, Theodore Blackwood, on the grounds that she has demonstrated the competence and financial capability necessary for self-governance." Elena heard the scratch of a pen as the court reporter recorded Marshall's opening statement. Every word spoken in this room would become part of the legal record that would determine her future, and she felt the weight of that permanence pressing down on her. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Caldwell addressed Theodore's attorney, "you're representing the respondent guardian?" "Yes, Your Honor," came a reedy voice that Elena didn't recognize. "We contend that Miss Morrison's blindness creates inherent vulnerabilities that require ongoing supervision for her own protection, and that her recent actions demonstrate impaired judgment that confirms the necessity of continued guardianship." Elena's hands clenched involuntarily at hearing her blindness characterized as inherent vulnerability. But Marshall had prepared her for exactly this argument. The key to their case was demonstrating that her blindness was simply a characteristic that required accommodation, not a disability that prevented competent decision-making. "Attorney Marshall," Judge Caldwell said, "you may present your case." Marshall stood and moved to the center of the courtroom, his voice carrying the confidence of thorough preparation. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that Miss Morrison has not only achieved independent living and meaningful employment, but has become a valued member of her community who contributes positively to the lives of others." Elena listened as Marshall systematically presented the documentation of her life in Springfield, her employment record at Whitman Mills, her financial independence, her contributions to quality control processes that had saved the company significant money. Each piece of evidence built toward the central argument that her blindness enhanced rather than hindered her professional capabilities. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Marshall continued, "Miss Morrison has used her own experience with blindness to help others facing similar challenges. She has been instrumental in helping an 8-year-old boy, recently blinded in an accident, learn to navigate independence and regain hope for his future." Elena felt Michael shifting in his seat behind her, and she knew the boy was bursting with excitement to tell the judge about his own progress. His presence in the courtroom was itself evidence of Elena's positive impact. A child who had once given up on life was now confident enough to travel to another state and participate in legal proceedings. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Caldwell said. When Marshall concluded his opening argument, "Your response?" Theodore's attorney stood, his voice carrying the dry formality of someone reciting familiar legal arguments. "Your Honor, the petitioner's recent employment success, while commendable, does not negate the fundamental vulnerabilities created by her blindness. Miss Morrison fled her legal guardian's care without authorization, placing herself in potentially dangerous circumstances that a fully competent individual would have avoided." Elena felt anger rising in her chest at the characterization of her escape to Springfield as evidence of incompetence rather than courage. But Marshall had warned her. that Theodore's side would attempt to frame her independence as recklessness. Additionally, Hartwell continued, the temporary nature of Miss Morrison's current arrangements highlights the instability inherent in her situation. Employment based on accommodating disability is inherently precarious, and without proper supervision, Miss Morrison faces the risk of exploitation or abandonment when such charity inevitably ends. Elena heard the word charity and felt her resolve strengthen. Her work at Whitman Mills wasn't charity, it was employment based on genuine skill and valuable contribution. The distinction was crucial to her sense of self-worth and to the legal argument for her competence. "Your Honor," Marshall said, rising for rebuttal, "we'd like to call our first witness to address these characterizations directly. Samuel Crawford, floor supervisor at Whitman Mills." Eleanor heard Crawford's heavy footsteps as he approached the witness stand, and she felt grateful for his willingness to travel from Springfield to testify on her behalf. His working-class background and practical experience would provide credibility that academic arguments might lack. "Mr. Crawford," Marshall began after Crawford was sworn in, "how long have you supervised Miss Morrison's work at Whitman Mills?" 4 months, Crawford replied, his voice carrying the straightforward honesty that Eleanor had come to associate with him. "Since October of last year." "Can you describe the nature of her responsibilities?" Crawford's explanation of Elena's quality control work was detailed and technical, emphasizing the skill and expertise required to detect flaws that visual inspection might miss. Elena felt pride swelling in her chest as Crawford described her professional capabilities with obvious respect and admiration. "In your professional opinion," Marshall asked, "is Miss Morrison's employment at Whitman Mills charity or legitimate?" "Skilled work?" Crawford's snort of amusement was audible throughout the courtroom. "Charity? Miss Morrison saves us money every week by catching problems that would cost us customer contracts if they reach the market. Her work is so valuable that Mr. Whitman has discussed promoting her to head of quality assurance." Elena gasped at this news, which Crawford hadn't mentioned during their preparation. The possibility of promotion provided even stronger evidence of her professional competence and value to the company. "Mr. Crawford," Theodore's attorney said during cross-examination, "isn't it true that Miss Morrison requires special accommodations that wouldn't be necessary for a sighted employee?" "Sure," Crawford replied matter-of-factly. "Same way a tall person needs a different size uniform, or a left-handed person needs different tools. Accommodation isn't the same as charity." Elena felt a surge of affection for Crawford's practical wisdom, his ability to reduce complex disability issues to simple common sense that any reasonable person could understand. The morning continued, with additional witnesses. Cornelius Whitman, testifying by telegram about Elena's professional value, Mrs. O'Brien describing her responsible management of household affairs, and Anna Brennan explaining Elena's positive impact on their family's recovery from Michael's accident. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Michael Brennan himself. "Your Honor," Marshall said after the adult witnesses had concluded, "we'd like to call Michael Brennan, age 8, to testify about Miss Morrison's work with blind individuals." Elena heard murmurs of surprise throughout the courtroom as the young boy made his way to the witness stand. Judge Caldwell's voice carried gentle curiosity as he addressed Michael directly. "Son, do you understand that you're in a courtroom where we discuss very serious matters?" "Yes, sir," Michael replied clearly. "Miss Elena taught me that serious matters require careful attention and honest answers." Elena felt tears threatening as she heard the confidence in Michael's voice, remembering the silent, withdrawn child she'd first met just weeks earlier. "Can you tell us about your relationship with Miss Morrison?" Marshall asked gently. Michael's testimony was simple but devastating to Theodore's case. He described his despair after losing his sight, his family's fear that his life was effectively over, and Elena's patient teaching that had helped him discover new ways to navigate the world with confidence and independence. Miss Elena showed me that being blind just means seeing differently, Michael said with the clarity that children bring to complex issues. She taught me that I can still do important things and help people just like she does. Michael, Judge Caldwell interjected gently, what do you think would happen if Miss Elena couldn't continue her work helping people like you? Michael considered this question seriously. Other kids like me might think they can't have good lives, he said finally. Miss Elena proves that blind people can do important work and help others. If someone takes that away from her, it's like saying blind people aren't as good as other people. Elena heard the profound silence that followed Michael's words, and she realized that the 8-year-old had articulated the fundamental principle at stake better than any legal argument could. This case wasn't just about her individual rights. It was about whether society would recognize the full humanity and potential of all blind individuals. When the testimony concluded, Judge Caldwell called for a brief recess before hearing closing arguments. Elena found herself surrounded by her supporters in the courthouse hallway, their voices carrying excitement and hope about how the morning had proceeded. Michael was incredible, Anna Brennan whispered, hugging her son close. He explained everything. Imperfectly, Elena knelt down to Michael's level, taking his hands in hers. Thank you for being so brave, she said. You helped the judge understand things that are hard to explain with grown-up words. Michael grinned with 8-year-old pride. I just told the truth about how you helped me. That's what you taught me to do. Always tell the truth, even when it's scary. When court reconvened for closing arguments, Elena felt the tension in the room intensify. Everything that had been presented during the morning's testimony would now be distilled into final arguments that would guide Judge Caldwell's decision. Marshall's closing was methodical and powerful, weaving together the evidence of Elena's competence with the broader principle that disability should not automatically disqualify someone from self-determination. He emphasized that guardianship should be reserved for individuals who genuinely could not manage their own affairs, not used as a tool to control people whose differences required accommodation rather than supervision. Theodore's attorney made a last attempt to frame Elena's blindness as inherent incompetence, but his argument sounded increasingly hollow after the morning's testimony. The evidence of Elena's success in Springfield, combined with Michael's powerful demonstration of her positive impact, had undermined the fundamental premise that blind individuals required constant supervision. Your Honor, Marshall concluded, Miss Morrison asks only for the same rights that every adult citizen expects, the right to make her own choices, succeed or fail on her own merits, and contribute to society according to her abilities. Her blindness is not a barrier to these rights. It's simply a characteristic that requires accommodation, not elimination of her fundamental humanity. Judge Caldwell was quiet for several long moments after the arguments concluded, his pen scratching against paper as he made notes. Elena felt her heart pounding so hard she was certain everyone in the courtroom could hear it. This case raises important questions about the intersection of disability and legal competence, Judge Caldwell finally said. The court must balance protection of vulnerable individuals against the fundamental right of adults to self-determination. Elena held her breath as the judge continued his analysis of the evidence and arguments. The testimony presented today demonstrates that Miss Morrison has achieved not merely independent living, but professional success and community contribution that any citizen might envy. Her blindness, rather than being a barrier to competence, appears to have enhanced her abilities in her chosen field of work. Elena felt hope rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm until the judge reached his final decision. Furthermore, Judge Caldwell continued, "The evidence suggests that Mr. Blackwood's guardianship decisions were influenced by financial considerations rather than Miss Morrison's best interests, which violates the fundamental obligations of a legal guardian." Elena heard Theodore's sharp intake of breath and realized that the judge had identified the weakness in his case that Marshall had worked so hard to expose. "Most significantly," Judge Caldwell said, "Miss Morrison's work with young Michael Brennan demonstrates that far from being a burden on society, she has become a resource for others facing similar challenges. This is not the behavior of someone requiring supervision, but of someone capable of providing guidance and support to others." Elena felt tears beginning to slip down her cheeks as she realized that the judge's analysis was moving in her favor. Therefore, Judge Caldwell announced, his voice carrying the finality of legal judgment, "This court grants the petition for termination of guardianship. Miss Elena Morrison is hereby declared competent to manage her own affairs and is released from all guardianship obligations to Theodore Blackwood, effective immediately." The courtroom erupted in quiet celebration as Elena's supporters expressed their joy at the decision. Elena herself felt overwhelming relief wash over her, followed immediately by the profound realization that she was, for the first time in her adult life, truly free to determine her own future. "Miss Morrison," Judge Caldwell addressed her directly, "you have demonstrated remarkable courage and competence in challenging legal assumptions about disability. I hope your success will encourage others facing similar circumstances to pursue their own paths to independence." Elena stood, her voice shaking with emotion. "Thank you, Your Honor. I hope to continue proving that blindness is just another way of seeing the world, not a barrier to participating fully in it." As they left the courthouse, Elena found herself surrounded by the community that had formed around her struggle for independence. Crawford was already making plans for their return to Springfield. Whitman had sent word about her upcoming promotion, and the Brennan family was discussing how Michael could continue his education with Eleanor's guidance. But perhaps most importantly, Elena realized that her victory had implications far beyond her individual circumstances. Other blind individuals facing similar legal challenges would now have precedent supporting their rights to self-determination. Her courage to fight Theodore's control had opened doors for countless others who had accepted limitation because they believed they had no choice. 6 months later, Elena Morrison stood in her expanded office at Whitman Mills, her fingers running over reports that documented significant improvements in quality control processes under her supervision as head of quality assurance. Through her open window, she could hear the sounds of Springfield's industrial district, but also something new: the voices of children learning navigation techniques in the courtyard behind her building. Elena had used part of her increased salary to establish the Morrison Center for Independent Living, a small school where blind children and adults could learn the practical and emotional skills necessary for independent life. Michael Brennan, now 9 and thriving, often assisted with younger students, his own transformation serving as inspiration for others beginning their own journeys toward independence. The legal victory in Hartford had been just the beginning. Elena's story had spread through networks of blind individuals and their families, creating demand for her teaching and advocacy throughout New England. What had started as a desperate flight from Theodore's control had evolved into a movement that challenged society's assumptions about disability and capability. Theodore himself had left Hartford shortly after the court decision, apparently unable to face the community's knowledge of his attempt to profit from selling his stepdaughter. Elena felt no particular satisfaction in his departure, but she was grateful that other young women in vulnerable situations might be spared similar exploitation. As evening approached and the mill's operations wound down for the day, Elena gathered her papers and prepared to lock her office. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: quality assessments, student consultations, and correspondence with other communities interested in establishing similar programs. But tonight, Elena Morrison would walk home to her own apartment, prepare her own dinner, and fall asleep in her own bed, secure in the knowledge that every choice she made was her own. The frightened young woman who had hidden among textile bales during her escape from Hartford no longer existed. In her place stood a confident professional, a skilled teacher, and most importantly, a person who had proven that courage could triumph over prejudice and that dignity was not dependent on others' recognition, but on one's own sense of worth. Elena's blindness, which Theodore had seen as nothing but limitation and burden, had become the foundation for a life of purpose and contribution that touched countless other lives. She had not simply escaped the fate he had planned for her. She had transformed her perceived weakness into a source of strength that benefited her entire community. As the last light faded from her office window, Elena Morrison smiled and headed home, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring to a woman who had learned to see her world with perfect clarity. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.